I'm really excited about this presentation today, and I'm glad we've got a small group rather than the hundreds that we were talking about before with when I give more of a keynote sort of address. So just a little bit about who we are. Turner International is a small, globally, I guess, recognized boutique, and we do a lot of team coaching and teams of teams work. And we also work in partnership with David Clutterbuck, and I'm also on faculty with the GTCI. So I'm kind of a teacher of team coaching, a practitioner of team coaching, and also the supervisor of team coaches. So I kind of have a wide systemic view. I personally have been coaching since about 2001. So I guess this is have the gray hairs to prove that I've done the work. I'm going to start off with just looking at what is happening today. Like if we kind of put ourselves into a systemic frame about looking at the wider ecosystem. And for those of you who have not heard that terminology before, what I'm looking at here is everything from, say, political climate, what's happening internationally, what kinds of conversations are people having, etc. And what is that then coming into the organizational sphere? What's then coming into the team sphere? So we're going to be looking at kind of that broad section of ecosystemic lenses, so to speak. So some of the things that I have been noticing and reading about, like all the geopolitical instability that's happening. I'm in the US right now, and oh my gosh, like it's such a wild situation to be in a country that's got two people that nobody wants to vote for. I shouldn't say nobody, but many people are not really behind that. They're voting for the least worst candidate, is what I'm hearing here, right? We've got recession going on. There's a big trend about sustainability, that word sustainability. It might be, economically, it might be because of the environment, it might be my energy, right? Like that word is in popular nomenclature all over the place. But equally, there's social unrest. Like, look at all of the riots and all of the people who are out there picketing or what have you that's going on. Like, it's pretty dire right now, all of the unrest. But I think things that are a little bit more kind of can't put your finger on it are things like, what about languishing? What about last year? There was a lot of stuff being published about the Great Resignation, lots of mental health issues in the post-pandemic uncertainty sort of realm, right? But then we also have this trend towards individualism. I'm the most important person. My well-being counts to me, matters to me. Whereas we're not looking sort of like the interdependencies of how we could increase resiliency, for example. And then, of course, I know EMCC is just doing a talk on this as well, but we've got the things like artificial intelligence. We've got a lot of fraud happening online, bots, so, all of the push for social media, etc. But yet there's this other thing that's happening as a result of all of that, kind of dire stuff that I'm painting a picture of, which is like, what about the splitting about us and them? Like, say, for example, a bit contentious, but the US and China, for example, or which is a great example of us and them. Whereas the cultures, I've spent a lot of time in China, and the cultures are really similar in a lot of ways. But people are really hungering for community connections and really wanting to be part of something bigger and really wanting to be part of a team and want those interdependencies. So as team coaches or as even individual coaches, what is our particular need to be in that? How can we support that? What are we being called to do? And or what are our stakeholders wanting from us? So this is a model that I have co-developed with my colleague, Michelle Lucas. And we actually developed this for supervision to work with supervisors around why supervision works. But actually, after we published this, we spent quite a number of years kind of getting a lot of peer review feedback and etc. There's an article published on this, etc. I started thinking about this and I thought, actually, this is exactly why team coaching works as well. This is why any sort of reflective way of being works. So I'm just going to walk you through the model quickly because it gives us some context around what we're going to be talking about today. So as you can see, we've got reflexive capacity on this axis, and we've got reflexive maturity on this axis. And so the more that you have capacity, or the more that you've got maturity in being able to learn, so have self-awareness, be able to see something more broadly, look at, mistakes, failures, successes, and then do that iterative process around, what have I learned as a result of that? Or what do I want to be doing differently? Or who am I wanting to be that's going to be a little bit differently in my way of being, right? And that's what we're talking about that reflexivity, that cold learning process, so to speak. So here at the very bottom is seeing myself. Like I can see myself, I can journal or write notes after a session to figure out what it is that I could have been doing differently. Or if I'm working in an interpersonal situation, I could be thinking, okay, so what's the impact to my kids, or what's the impact to my partner, or what have you. But I can see myself usually if I've got some sort of capacity and maturity. But sometimes in order to get alternative perspectives, we need other people's inputs around that, right? And so oftentimes it's useful to, in a supervision context, for example, you can hire a professional supervisor and they can help you see alternative perspectives about yourself. Or your partner is always happy to provide alternative perspectives, aren't they? And then in team coaching, what about your co-coach? Can they help you see alternative perspectives about yourself, right? And then seeing the system, the next tier up here, we still are seeing ourselves and seeing alternative perspectives. But in seeing the system, this is when we start understanding about, okay, so what's going on with the team? I'm not responsible for the entire team on my own shoulders. I am, however, responsible for giving the team some opportunities to see themselves, right? And so I have to look at what are some of the dynamics between team members? What are some of the things that stakeholders might be seeing in this team, etc. Then we get to the next level up, and this is about seeing complex adaptive systems. So for those of you who've been to some of our team coaching training programs, this is second nature to you, hopefully by this stage. But what we're talking about here is really looking at what is flexing, what's changing as a result of maybe one person or one influence or one change within the organization. So if you're coaching teams, for example, who are working on internal and external processes, and they change something in their billing system, for example, they will then see all of these changes that are going to put stress on the team that you're coaching, right? So how do we support them? How do we see the change ourselves? But how do we then bring that awareness to the team so that they can start looking at it? And in the seeing complex adaptive systems, and in the next tier up, seeing beyond, what happens is that what we want is we want to engage the system itself to look at itself, right? You notice as I'm talking about that, is that what happens is that the more people who can reflect, the more, as we would say, number of eyes, if you're a supervisor, the more number of eyes who can look at the system, you can then start looking into the future. You can start looking beyond. What else is possible? If we imagine that we can create this sort of future, then what does that look like down the track? So what this middle arrow is, I probably should have said that before, but what the middle arrow is here is the field of work. So whatever it is that's the content or the thing that we're collectively looking at or working on is the field. So notice I went up the spiral and it gets more kind of complex and bigger, right? Because you need a bigger expanse. You need more reflexivity, the bigger the field is that we're looking at. But the reality is that the way you actually work this is not linear. You don't go from seeing the system to seeing complex adaptive systems. You might in that moment say, oh my gosh, we're talking about something beyond where we were before. But then you have an insight about yourself. Oh, I didn't word that properly. So you're then back to self-reflection. Or you might see the wider system and say, oh, I need to remember to talk to the team leader after this meeting about X. So it's not linear, but you can actually move around because it's explaining kind of why we need to have that level of maturity so that we can have the capacity and the maturity to see into those things and also know when we want to kind of engage the team around that, because we might see it, but until my co-coach and I have a chance to talk about it, it might not be appropriate to bring it into the system. So that's also a level of maturity that's needed. I thought this was really cool. I mean, even though this research was done a little while ago, I think this is even more true today in a post-pandemic world. People are, if they don't feel that they are in a team and that they trust their leaders, then people are leaving. I mean, this is like the Great Resignation that we saw being written up about last year, right? And this has always been the case. Like people who are not on a team and are feeling disenfranchised from the organization or from having purpose will oftentimes be the first to leave, right? And so this particular article might be something that you want to pick up. I couldn't share it because, of course, it's from Harvard Business Review, but it's got some really interesting points around here. And I have used this quite successfully to engage leaders on why team coaching matters. In the practitioner program that we teach for team coaching, one of the tools that's in that toolkit is a team readiness tool. And I think it's one of my favorite tools in the whole toolkit that we do. Why? Because it kind of, I guess the thread before we go on to the next section of the section of the session is that, like we are so hungering as team coaches sometimes to get the work that we just assume the team is ready because that's what they've hired us for. But actually, the team needs some maturity. Actually, the team needs to be bought in. It may mean that we need to do the team readiness tool, for example, and then that is the engagement. And then we decide, okay, we're going to recontract and we're going to do some leadership development first, or we're going to do a couple of team building workshops, or we're going to do something else. I'm going to go to an observed meeting and give some feedback, right? There are all sorts of different options there. So what are we actually signing up for and what's in that contract with that team? We're going to talk a little bit about future. So what are some of the trends? One of the big threads that I think when I was preparing for this is that underpins all of these sort of systemic inputs that we've been talking about is this idea around apathy to renewal. So, even when people are feeling overwhelmed, they're just in the hamster wheel, right? They're just doing a lot of things, but they don't feel purposeful, right? There's a big difference between getting up every day, putting your feet on the floor and going, yes, I am ready for the day and I'm going to go out and, I have the world surrounding me and I matter, right? Like how many people actually do that? Whereas what we would like is for people to feel that more often than not, right? For ourselves as well. And so what are some of those opportunities to start getting people to feel that sense of purpose again, that sense of belonging, to feel engaged? And I think one of them, as we all know, again, anecdotally, but probably there's some minor research out there, but about being deeply heard and understood is why coaching works, right? I mean, it's why human relationships work, at least at the end of the day. So if I feel really deeply heard and understood and people get me, I feel enriched. I feel purposeful again. I feel connected to a bigger purpose. And I know it's kind of an interesting word to use, but one of the words that I've been talking a lot about recently is this concept of brotherhood. And I think it's kind of an outdated word, but it's so important right now, right? It's like that sense of community. It's even bigger than that. It's like, how do we collectively support each other? It's that interdependency that we were talking about a few minutes ago. So what other things might we need to get that renewal, that sense of that feeling of brotherhood, that sense of I matter in the world for teams and for individuals, right? We're all coaches, so we're working in both of those in both of those sort of modes, whether one-to-one or one-to-many. Another one of the inputs that I wanted to put out there is that, I kind of wanted to once again be a little bit of a pot stirrer here, in that in Asia, there's a lot of heroic leadership that still exists today, right? It's the boss is in the middle. I work for the boss, and then the boss reports to the rest of the organization or to the level above them, right? And is that always the right way to go? Are there some opportunities where we can have more of team leadership, where the team leaders share responsibility with the team members and empower them to maybe give some of that control over or create some of those interdependencies, or look at cross connections so that you're both bringing expertise into the team, but you're also sharing expertise across and outside of the organization. And, I'm not suggesting, obviously there is a little bit of a bias in this, because there's lots of evidence to support the fact that the more that we can have that cross-pollination, organizations are actually better off. But equally, if we go in with that bias to an organization, you just create defensiveness. And so how do you start understanding what the team is looking for, what that team leader is looking for? And is this actually the future? Is this what is needed by that team? Is that what's needed by that organization? It may be, it may not be, but it's definitely a tension because it creates the us and them, right? So we talked about that systemically before. We know us and them exist today. So what's the antidote to that? What does the future look like? Now, this slide, for those of you who've done the practitioner or senior practitioner programs, have seen this already. This is David Clutterbuck's work. And I love this because it really sort of highlights, what do you actually need? And what are some of the things that you could be offering to teams? So kind of above the line here in the middle, we've got short-term things that a team might be needing. And down here at the bottom, we've got more longer term, more, you might take months, might take a few years, what have you. On the right side of the line, we've got capability and capacity building. And on the left side, we've got problem solving. So in the team building sphere here, this is when, those 2-day away love-ins, as we used to call them, but actually really important. Why? Because they just might need to have a couple of days out to get their heads together and start feeling like they belong to something bigger. In the facilitation space, this is much more about kind of, we need to solve a problem today. Can you help us? And you go in and you support them to do that. Might be using team coaching skills, but there's nothing that's probably changed or more transformational as a result of that. If there's a long-term problem and it might take a while to fix, something like a merger or an acquisition or what have you, then we're in the consulting sphere. And then at the very bottom here, what we want is, in that team coaching space, excuse me, we've got more of that. We're working longer term. We are trying to build capacity and capability so that the team can do the learning when you're not in the room with them. And so again, it's like, what is the team actually asking of you? And what are you co-creating? So if we look at Hawkins' model, then we are really looking much more kind of like in that co-learning space, or even looking maybe in the clarifying space, which is in the upper left-hand corner there. So those are some things to be thinking about as you're going out there and looking at how are you striking a longer term solution with your client. Now, I don't want to spend a lot of time on this particular diagram here, but why I wanted to put this up here is that I think that there's a disconnect between team coaches and what the client wants. So I think it's worthwhile to kind of talk about that and think about your own bias and think about your own way of being around this. Because I think that by and large, when I go out and I talk to team coaches, there is a industry-wide bias that we are there to get people to work better together and to like each other. So really work in the relational space and, kind of play happy families. And I can tell you firsthand that team members on teams do not necessarily have to like each other in order to work together. They can still make decisions and get stuff done, which is what a team is meant to do. So if your mindset is that you may be not getting the work that you want because actually what they want is, how do we make decisions? How do we solve problems? What are some of the really pragmatic things that are going to keep our business turning over or that are going to get things done? Somebody mentioned here earlier today about, oh yeah, all we're doing is we just want to get in and get stuff done, and how can you help us make it do it faster, right? And that's not, like we got two, this is the S and them piece again, right? It's two ends of the spectrum. There needs to be a middle part here. And so I put this up here because I think that this is a really interesting point about the fact that, well, actually, today, if we are in an organization and we've got all of these systemic things happening outside of us, then we are at least at technical and adaptive, right? And more than likely, we need to be adaptive. And so therefore, it requires learning. It requires stakeholder engagement. And so why not have some help from the outside? Or why not have an internal team coach and an external team coach working side by side? This really comes to life when you start looking at the interdynamics between teams, because I think I saw a statistic recently, like most people are part of a team. This is the matrix structure, right? Most people are in a team as a team member, but they actually belong to something like 5 to 7 different teams in most organizations. And so, this then becomes really important, this last line around, how do we help teams to look at this so that they can also be more adaptive and support themselves? So I personally am not going to have the time to go into all of the stuff around AI because we could talk all day about this, right? But one of the things that I did want to bring into the conversation here is about the fact that many of the organizations that I've been working with are actually adopting AI in a big way. And so things like all of the Microsoft Office suites are going to have AI inbuilt into them. So if that's the case, then, and you're getting an email from someone who is actually having a robot write it for them, rather than them writing it themselves, what does that do to the interpersonal dynamics within organizations, right? That's just one example of this. And that's a negative, right? A positive might be, though, that people have more time freed up, supposedly, as a result of the technology. And so, therefore, are they actually using their time more effectively? And if so, doing what? And how are we supporting those teams to look more broadly into the future as AI is coming into the system, where they're going to be spending their time, as opposed to, oh, it's a cost-cutting measure, or it's an efficiency or an effectiveness measure in an organization. Like, what are they going to be doing then differently as a result of that? Like, I'd like to have that conversation with teams, right? I think that if we take everything we've talked about today into kind of a broad brush of fostering collectivism, like that idea of brotherhood that we were talking about before, that how do I feel a sense of purpose, belonging to something bigger? And it might be because we were able to have a really great new way of doing meeting cadence. Most boring thing that as a team coach you can probably sit through, but guess what? The team got huge value from that conversation with you. right? And that may then make them feel like, oh yeah, we're all in it together again. So, it could be something quite simple. I think that we imagine that, oh yeah, we're going to go in there and the team are going to be transformed and, you know, all of this much more high flying type of thing. But in the many thousands of hours of team coaching I've done, a lot of the meetings are really boring. And I'm not trying to dampen our spirits here, but actually just by us being there and witnessing, and again going back to that concept of deeply listening, deeply understanding what the topic is, and asking a few good questions or underscoring or helping them with the pacing of that dialogue, can be one of the most impactful things that you can do. So, fostering collectivism, what is that? Many people have talked about teaming before, right? Amy C. Edmondson is probably the person who's, most popularized it, and she's on to failure now, as everyone knows. But I think that I love this Cambridge Dictionary idea about the activity of working together as a team. Like that really nails it for me, right? So, how do we support that? And where can organizations benefit? So, some of the things that I have come up with here for us as thought starters are things like there are lots of temporary teams in organizations, and are they actually effective? Like they're important, but are they impactful because they're temporary and they know it? Or because their mission is only for a few months? Or they know that they need to work together and it's quite hair on fire sort of environment, but actually, are they concentrating on the things that really matter? Major decisions, right? I talked about the grid about in complex adaptive systems. How do we make decisions differently? So teaming is actually a really great way to do that. Supporting business as usual issues. If you're in a hospital, totally different BAU sort of thing than what it is if you're in a standard organization. But equally, as I've just talked about, it may be going through spreadsheets with them. Someone else today already mentioned this other one around shift working or hybrid working, working across countries. If you're working internationally, even with small organizations, like in Australia, lots of mining companies are owned by North American organizations. So, they might be a powerhouse in Australia, but they are owned by someplace else. Or American companies that own other organizations internationally, what have you, or Chinese companies owning other offshoots and etc. Like these are bigger organizations, but even in small ones, this type of cross-country working is challenging because people are working more globally than ever before. So this is borrowed from Amy's work, and one of the things that I really want people to start thinking about is, first of all, what is the concept of failure? And how do we support people in looking at what that is as an opportunity for growth? But also your job as the boss. Like we are predominantly getting work as coaches from the team leader or from the most important decision maker or what have you. So are we exploring this as we're contracting with them? Are we really getting our head around what it is that they are trying to do? And is there a fit for us? Is there an opportunity to create a learning environment? And is that part of their future? And if not, is it our job to help them to look at co-creating that? Yeah. So this is our particular definition around it, which is contracting is a dialogue that establishes and then sustains the relationship. Contracting is important at the beginning of a relationship to set out the initial terms of the engagement, i.e., it creates the contract, an agreement between parties. And why I'm pausing a few minutes around this is that I'm on record of saying that actually team coaching isn't that complicated, because all you really need to do is to be able to do contracting and to be able to provide some scaffolding and some in the form of things like maybe a few tools, but actually it's more listening and contracting. And so if you know how to do that, that's probably all the team needs from you. And so how good are you at actually contracting? And contracting is just a dialogue, right? And it can be done at any point in the engagement. Whereas in this definition I just read out, which is in part mine, we talk about the beginning of the contracting, but actually, as soon as something changes, are you recontracting? Or if you are unclear about what your role is, are you recontracting? Or if you're getting a sense that you're going in a different direction than what the contract originally stated, are you recontracting? Right? So how often are you actually going into that dialogue to start thinking about systemically what's needed and what's my role in that and how do I engage the system or the team in that conversation around my contract or around what I thought I was here to do? So this is my shared outcomes model. Most people, when you get hired for an engagement, want a shared outcome, and they want accountability and responsibility, right? We all want that. But actually, where the problems arise and where we start going below the line emotionally is because we don't have a shared understanding about what we agreed to or what we said we were going to do, right? And so you can actually teach this model to teams. I'm giving it away for free. Please go use it. There's an article that goes with it, etc. Because I have found in working with teams over the last 10 years or what have you, since I published this model, that people really get it and will start using it. Because if one person is below the line and starts blaming other team members, then everybody will start going below the line. But if we can kind of help them to understand, oh, let's approach this with some compassion and curiosity for argument's sake, and look at, so what was our shared understanding about what we're talking about? Or what, Bob, did you think that you were signed up to do, and how has that changed? They immediately come above the line and start talking about the shared understanding. It's quite simple. And then once we understand what that is, then we can revisit what the shared outcome is and start looking at responsibilities and accountabilities. Yeah. So in the last kind of dialogue here, I'm curious about how can you engage collectivism? Like what has dawned on you as a result of today? Because that's actually what the future of coaching is, in my opinion. Just one word, collectivism. The other stuff is just thought starters. Some of the other topics that we've talked about today, I think that it's a really easy thing for people to understand what it is. And even with teaming, like it's popularized, but people don't understand what that is. Whereas people understand what collective is. And it's like I can automatically opt into that. Yeah, I want to be part of the collective. I want to be a part of the wider imperative. So that's in part why I chose that wording, but it's also to me like what's needed. Like there's a lot of us and them that I'm seeing, as I've talked about already tonight a lot. But there's also, this need for belonging, this, I want to be part of something bigger, this purposefulness. How does one help clients understand what team coaching can bring to the table? I'm hoping that you got some of that today, but in general, I think that this is much more about kind of supporting, co-creating with them. Because I can go in and say, here's what the research says, or here's what my experience says, etc. But if they don't see the value in it, then you're never going to get them over the line, or you're going to get a client and they may not be happy with it. So it's about really looking for those kind of like, what are the opportunities here? And it may be that for that team, you need to do a team readiness tool, for example. Or with that team, you need to go in and observe a meeting and see how they're relating to each other. Or with this team, they may only want you to help them in getting that budget met. And that might be enough. Like that might be great. I just wanted to quickly go through. We've got the books that you might want to think about getting. One of them is the Practitioner's Handbook of Team Coaching, which was kind of the seminal book that's got a whole bunch of different ways of doing team coaching, tips and tricks, all of that. A book that I co-wrote with David and my colleague Colin Murphy. This is a bunch of case studies, and there's 23 case studies in there, which kind of gives you a flavor of how are people doing team coaching or have done team coaching in the past. So my last closing slide is hopefully a more inspirational one for everybody. But in order to evolve, organizations and their people must be open to learning and change. We understand the value of commitment as being fundamental to this process. So I know you guys are all committed to your teams and organizations, and I'm so pleased and proud to be among peers and making a difference systemically. So thanks for joining me. And if you have any comments or questions or whatever, please reach out. We love to hear from people.